Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the show. We'll get to our really interesting guest this week in just a minute, but first, a little administrative update. You may be wondering where the podcast was, my solo podcast for this week. And as it happened, I was really sick the last few days, and I was feeling better yesterday, but apparently not good enough to do a podcast because I made several attempts and it did not go well. So I'll resume that next week. And then I also want to let you know that this is going to be the last interview, YouTube interview I'm going to be doing for this year. And in 2022, we'll look to resume that. So without further ado, I want to welcome my special guest, Sean Clifford. Sean is the CEO of Canopy, which is an anti-pornography software company, makes software to block porn on phones and other devices. We'll talk a lot about that. You can find them on the web at canopy.us. So, Sean, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me on. Honored to close out the year.
Yeah, and quite a topic, too, because porn is something that saturates our society in a way that it has really never been the case before, and especially children's lives in the way that it never was before. And I think it can be harder for even people of, Generation X, which is my generation, or even maybe older millennials, and certainly like baby boomers, to relate to what's really going on with porn and kids in the world today. So I guess my first question is, what's different now about porn? Because we've always had it. So what's different about today's porn?
It's such a good question. And I'll just emphasize that, yes, on the one hand, this is a perennial problem. Plato warned about the dangers of porn when it was little drawings on clay shards thousands of years ago. So this has been around with us for a while. But what we're dealing with today is completely different. And to set up that contrast, really tease out the novelties, I'll draw up two things. The first is Playboy. I think when most people, especially Gen X and above, think of pornography, they think of Playboy. Static magazine, somewhat hard to obtain, had to go to the sketchy part of the store or video counter to get it. And that defined for them. And by all means, there were many problems with Playboy, but by today's standards, Playboy looks like a church bulletin newsletter.
Playboy actually did have articles too.
Yeah.
I mean, they even those old Playboy interviews, you can buy them for 99 cents each on Amazon. And I went back and listened to the Jimmy Carter one, read the Jimmy Carter one. They used to have guys like Jimmy Carter there. It actually was, there was actually some content in there too, although I don't think that's why people were reading it.
Well, I mean, that was always the joke, right? I get it for the articles. And as a matter of fact, in light of new porn, as we call it, it became so prevalent that Playboy for a while stopped publishing nudes in the magazine. They just couldn't compete. There was no compelling value prop to serving up their model because it was so accessible everywhere. So to tease out the difference between Playboy and Pornhub, three things we should know. The first is simply the accessibility. Playboy or your old VHS tape was hard to get, and you had to go to the creepy section in the video store. Today, on the other hand, it is immediately and instantly accessible at the touch of a few buttons anywhere you go at any time of day with the littlest of effort. Second thing is the quantity. The old porn was a magazine or one VHS tape. Now there's nearly infinite content online. And that makes a huge difference because of the way that our brains are wired, where we crave novelty. And also the ability to actually fulfill those desires can trigger some pretty problematic trends in our brain that lead us on this escalating path towards addiction. So the quantity has changed. And then the last thing is the intensity. So whereas old porn was maybe 12 static images or one sequence that you could watch over and over again, today it's more potent than it's ever been before. It's gone from static images to high definition videos with infinite novelty, which we really crave. And as a result, you put all those things together and we have the most bingeable pornography ever made. And it's really driving a big impact in terms of its harm, its addictive nature, and how it's forming our expectations and understanding of sex, intimacy, healthy relationships, and so many other things. So just across the board, if you think that porn is Playboy, you're living in a different era and not attuned to the damage and the harm that's actually being done today.
Yeah, the internet is really a game changer in terms of distribution for everything. And some of that is very good. So I probably wouldn't have an audience today if there was no internet. But internet, also lets, basically anything get up there. So any kind of bizarre sex fetishes, any sort of stuff produced in countries without any sort of ethical rules, or if you even can even consider this ethical, it's like it's all there and anybody who wants it can get it. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's two things. Number one, the pornography now results in escalating demand, both in terms of the quantity and what's out there. So your typical 16-year-old boy that may start, in order to get the same effect each time, needs to go a little bit more extreme and a little bit more novel. And so if you keep this up for a few years, you may find your taste have changed in ways that you wouldn't expect or have predicted at the very outset. And the distribution channel then has also opened up the possibility for those new needs to be fulfilled. And I'll just give you one example. Between 2018 and 2019, the number of images of child pornography or child sexual abuse material, CSAM, as it's now called, jumped by 40 million. And I mean, it is going in a really problematic direction. And the internet has really opened up the doors, both in terms of the ability to provide that, but then also luring our taste in a certain very problematic direction.
Yeah, you mentioned video. I think a lot of the porn today is like video clips on like these porn tube type ones. There's a bunch of them, but I think they're all actually owned by like one company or something like that. They've consolidated. And did they use like algorithms like Netflix or, a lot of these social media companies have extremely sophisticated algorithms like TikTok, Instagram, that they know exactly how to get you, to press the like button to keep you engaged. I watched that Netflix documentary. Of course, they got me with the algorithm, right? The Social Dilemma, where it talks, kind of brought to life how they're sort of using all this psychological research and stuff to manipulate you. Do the porn sites do the same thing?
Yeah, look, I think we could extrapolate from big tech writ large with the Social Dilemma went into to great effect. When you have a business model that depends upon harvesting attention and keeping users engaged on site as long as possible, that produces incentives to try to, as the industry now calls it, hack people's cognitive vulnerabilities. So we now know, Twitter knows that rage keeps people engaged. Sex also sells. And so, the one thing that I lament about The Social Dilemma, which I thought was a great film, but they skipped one of the biggest hacks that the tech industry has used to keep people engaged. And you see this in sometimes softer forms on Instagram, but porn proliferates on the internet. Sex does sell, and it's used to great effect to keep people on site, scrolling, turning to the next thing. So the porn industry is no different from big tech in this respect. They're very sophisticated in terms of understanding how to figure out what works for you, what you want, and then to serve that to you to try and keep you locked in place. Pornhub, which is one of the largest one of these sites that you've mentioned, owned by MindGeek, has actually a very impressive insights data analytics team that just puts out the studies and reports, and they know, and their algorithms can go toe to toe with a lot of the other big companies out there.
As I was talking, I hadn't even put this in my notes as something to ask you, but you go to any site today and all the fingerprinting and the cookies, and they know exactly who you are. Do all these sites like literally know who you are, even if you give them no info? They can cross-reference it from other things, probably. I mean, is it that sophisticated?
I'm not in touch with the porn sites myself, but look, I think it's a safe assumption. And there's an article I read about this a couple of years ago that when you go anywhere online today, you probably should assume that they know who you are and they're tracking it and they're building out a profile. And I think that's especially true with pornography.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I never thought of it that, now that they've built all these databases, pretty much the same things that Google and Facebook have used, they could use as well, pretty readily. It's amazing what, people can find out about you. Even if they can't figure out you, they can figure out everything about you from just the smallest amount of information. It's pretty spooky, I guess, how predictable we are. And I think the thing that really comes in with Canopy is all of this today is being directed at people who are 11, 14, 17 years old, who have these internet enabled smartphones. Some of them, no doubt, even younger than that, who are then have access to all this stuff. And I mean, no doubt, certainly the boys at least are going to, when they find one of these sites, they're going to show all their buddies and like game over, right? In about 30 seconds, they're all, got it bookmarked basically.
Yeah, as a result of the accessibility, the age of exposure is dropping. Story from the New York Times a couple of years ago put the age of exposure for girls at 14, for boys at 13. A more recent study estimated that it was somewhere between 9 and 10 years old for kids. So much of this is really linked to just the proliferation of smart devices, and in particular, smartphones. So we went effectively from the invention and distribution of the iPhone in 2007 to near universal penetration in just about 12 years. And on the one hand, that's amazing because we're pro tech and I think the internet's incredible and a lot of things to laud. And even if you don't think that, it's not going away. But it's also brought a lot of challenges and dangers with it. And unfettered access to porn is one of them. And one of the things that I think these porn companies prey on is that at age 10, typically, as you grow, certain questions start to pop into your mind around what sex is, and the internet is, it's become the new source of sex education. And
there's plenty of people out there that would happily answer questions for you.
And it is. I mean, Pornhub built their own sex education tab within their site. Unclear who they're targeting it to, but needless to say, a lot of kids under the age of 18 are happening on that. And when you have questions that are awkward and uncomfortable to ask, which this stuff always is, the internet feels like an anonymous place to go to try and find answers, just for natural curiosity. But once you're exposed to this type of content, you can't unsee it, and it sparks other questions and other interest, and kind of you trip down a rabbit hole. And so I think they play into that. One last thing I'll say on this is, if you look at some of the prior insights from the largest porn site out there are 2 times a day when traffic peaks. And this, I think, was from 2019. One was between like 10:30 and 11:30 at night, and the other was between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. And so at night, probably not a big surprise, but the question is, what's happening between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m.? And it's when kids are getting out of school. And so we can get into a discussion about whether they are purposefully targeting kids to try and lock in long-term customer value and get them hooked early, akin to the accusations leveled against the big tobacco companies, or whether they're simply building a platform that's very addictive and very accessible, and they're not discerning about who finds their way onto it. But kids are finding their way onto it at young ages when their brains are still developing. And it's so harmful when that happens.
Yeah, it's a challenge because I think the typical approach to this that a lot of people suggested is you just got to make sure your kids don't have a smartphone. And, I think there's something to be said for, the notion of keeping, your kids away from screens when they're super young. And I have a 4-year-old son, and, we don't, he doesn't have a tablet or anything like that. So that's the decision we've made. But the idea that I'm going to keep him from having a phone until he turns 18 and can buy it, that's just not going to happen. You can't protect people from the world by just sheltering them too much from the world and then turning them loose into it without ever having acquired the skills to navigate it,
Yeah.
It's like a lot of these kind of like, this is the critique of homeschooling. And again, I'm not saying it's necessarily has to end up that way, but it can for some people. I think if you just try to bubble yourself off from all these forces, sometimes you don't, it's only delaying the inevitable at some level.
Yeah. Well, look, in the Clifford house, our rule is we get our kids devices when they voted in their second presidential election. So that's we're tackling it. But look, so much of the world is moving online. So whether you want to delay it, and I do think there's actually a very strong argument for delaying, especially as driven by our understanding of neuroscience. If you first see this type of content when you're 7 versus 9 versus 11, it makes a difference because of where your brain is in its development phase. So like pushing the stuff back out as far as you can is something that we ought to strive for. At the same time, I think you're right. The goal is that you want your kid to be able to navigate this on their own with some wisdom, and also some understanding of what's out there and why they should aim for something higher and better. And purely blocking them doesn't get you the full way there. Our hope at Canopy is to give you enough space to create enough of a postponement of exposure for you to have those conversations where you can then say, hey, look, this stuff exists. And here's why we think it's problematic. And here's why some people find it tempting. But ultimately, here's why you should aim for something higher and know that when you encounter it, come talk to us. We won't be angry. And like, if you can start to lock that in, I mean, regrettably, 93% of American teenage boys will have seen hardcore pornography by the time they're 18. I'm actually dubious that about the other 7%.
It seems a rather low percentage there.
Yeah. And like it's out there, and you can't lock down every single device. So you've got to prepare yourselves for that inevitability, as painful as that is. But what you do in the interim, in terms of pushing it off and creating space and having conversations, can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I guess I'm not officially too old to be really in with the kids and understanding what they're doing. I was pretty good at pretty good at talking with a lot of millennial college students, and I still keep touch with like MBA schools and go talk to classes and things like that. But really, the Gen Z, I'm not really that understanding of all their cultural peculiarities. But this digital saturation in general, and the in porn in particular, does seem to be having an impact. And I read things. So I'm going to ask you how real this is, because I read these very alarming reports. Like, for example, I said this, maybe I just misremembered this, or it was some fringe site. No, I went out and Googled it right before our interview. It's in The Guardian, different places. It's like teenage boys are now having erectile dysfunction because of pornography. It's like men in their 20s are like, what? It just seems crazy. And on the one hand, I always think that kind of this moral panic over the youth is like another perpetual recurring feature of society. But I do see some statistics. The rates of sexual activity for young people is way down. I might think that's good in some moral respects, but I don't think it's happening because they've all decided to, take a vow of chastity. I think it's because they've, they're retreating into these online worlds of video games and porns. Have you done any research? Do you have how real is this? What's really going on, and especially the lives of these young people as a result of some of this online porn?
Yeah, well, look, I'll acknowledge at the outset, I'm biased. I'm dedicating myself to this, so I think it's a problem. But I think the evidence is there to suggest that something different is taking place here. And I'll run through a couple of statistics just to kind of paint this case, and don't take my word for it. Like, all this is available out there and you can look it up. Mm-hmm. When you go back 20 years and you look at men who had erectile dysfunction as reported to medical providers, 0% of them were under the age of 30. Today, 25% of men who have erectile dysfunction as reported to medical providers are under the age of 30. Something has happened, and that thing is pornography. And it's the availability and it's the novelty that comes through it. So whether you want to look at the physiological impacts, if you actually want to look at the brain, like we now have, thanks to advances in fMRI scanning, you can look at what's happening to the brain as someone watches pornography, both in a single moment, but then over time. And it mimics a lot of the other sequences you see in the brain with respect to addictive elements, whether that's heroin or sugar or other things that we encounter out there. So like, we now know from a scientific, remove the moral argumentation and the finger wagging from this entirely, from a purely empirical standpoint, we now know this is having a big impact on people. Then when you layer in some of the longitudinal social science data, you see that pornography is cited as one of the leading causes of divorce. You see a lot of men having failure to launch, the emergence of this incel movement that's tied to video games and pornography. and you see how attitudes about entering into relationships and how we view people of the opposite sex has also shifted significantly over time. So like, no matter where you turn, something significant has happened, really dating back to about 2008. And this has been advanced, whether it's in The Social Dilemma. Jean Twenge wrote an excellent book called iGen, in which she looks at overall measurements of mental health shifted pretty dramatically. Nothing to parallel this across the last 80 years with the advent of the smartphone. So look, I'm always mindful that are we owing to our own beliefs engaging in cognitive bias? But I think the data here is pretty clear. And the thing that I find most compelling is if you go out and in a privileged, respectful way, have real conversations with kids, this is everywhere. This is something that they talk about all the time. So if you go talk to guidance counselors or counselors at school or youth counselors at churches, or like go talk to anyone who's actually got their finger on the pulse of what's going on with the youth, and they'll all tell you that this is unprecedented and something that really is shaping how the generation is thinking about a whole host of issues.
Yeah, I can't even imagine, like, if I had been, a teenager and had access to this stuff on a phone. You don't have to imagine very, very much what I would probably been doing. I mean, it's crazy. And even humongous amounts of adults, adult porn, use is off the charts, in these churches and things like that. It seems to be, all the men's ministries are very focused on, kind of talking about porn and anti-porn is like, most all, like I've heard from plenty of guys that like, how do I get off of porn? And there are plenty of just these, very secular, men's self-improvement types out there who are selling courses on how to get off porn, because the guys are like I can't stop looking at this stuff. And it's, it's crazy. I mean, I feel, I feel very fortunate that, literally I don't have any desire to go look at porn these days, which is amazing. Now, it helps to be 52 years old. But even at my age, I have little doubt that if I said, well, let me just go out to Pornhub and see what's going on, and, it wouldn't take much, and you just get hooked like that. It's pretty amazing. But I think, probably the majority of adult men are also consuming a ton of online porn.
Yeah, I mean, just the numbers out there are astounding around this. And look, the one anecdote on this point is a few years ago, a Canadian researcher wanted to understand the impact of consuming pornography, and so they tried to assemble a group of college-age boys who had been watching porn and those that hadn't, and they ultimately had to cancel the study. They couldn't find that control group that hadn't watched porn in the last 2 months. And so, look, it's out there. It's very tempting. Our brains were not built for this level of temptation. Mm-hmm. And this is, there's a broader, I think, conversation there about how we live in a world that has basically been hacked to present the most temptation possible, whether it's in food or caffeine or any number of things. Caffeine, just as a quick aside, the average cup of coffee you get at a diner today is about 4 times more caffeinated than it was 30 or 40 years ago.
No, I didn't know that.
Played a role in that. There's an interesting book called The Hacking of the American Mind. The first third's very interesting, but it makes the case that our brains were not built for this level of ongoing, sustained temptation. And
by the way, once a year, I do a 30-day caffeine fast, and I can tell you the first week of it is, I feel bad. And I have to make sure not to schedule that when anything important is going to happen, because I'm like, wow, this is rough. This is rough. So yeah, I can believe it.
So when you're living in a world in which the goods that we encounter are more potent and intense than they've ever been before across the board, but including pornography, irrespective of what you want, it's very difficult to escape it and to resist it. And so That's why I think ultimately, if we're going to prevail on this issue, it's got to be some combination, but we've got to find a solution that doesn't rely on the individual willpower in the same way that in the conversations around social media that are taking place right now, you've got your average hormonal teenager that's going up against the product that was designed by a team of neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists to find out exactly what you want and push all the right buttons. And it's just not a fair fight, right? And that's what we find in the pornography case study as well. And we've got to find steps to overcome it, because all the things we care about, whether it's healthy relationships or kids being kids or marriages forming and lasting, just are a lot harder if we don't get this right.
So how did you get initially interested in the fight against pornography? I got to figure out how to phrase that. I was originally going to say, I was making my notes, how did you first get interested in pornography? And I'll phrase that a little differently. How did you get interested in the fight against pornography?
Three little anecdotes that add up to the origin story. The first is I had a buddy who incidentally was the lead investor for Canopy. Second time we ever met, we sat down in the Mayflower Hotel in DC over breakfast, and he asked what I would do if I made $50 million, never had to work again. So I probably gave him some inane answer, but I then asked him the same question. And he said he would dedicate himself to overcome the scourge of pornography. And this was back in 2007. This was the first time that I heard someone speak about it, not as a mild irritant or something that probably isn't good for us, but a force that was going to derail people's lives in a meaningful way that we needed to take seriously. And so that was kind of the first seed that was planted. The second was I had kids. I've now got 4 kids, and just seeing the world that they grow up in. Again, I think technology is amazing. I don't think we can escape it. I don't think we should escape it. But gosh, I'd sure love for them to grow up without this toxic stuff constantly being accessible all over the place. And both for my kids, but for others. I want kids to have a chance to be kids. And then I think the third thing is I've just seen the suffering that has come from this. So like the more I started to look at it, the more I've got friends who've gone through divorces from this. I have friends who, they would say themselves that they're addicted. The rhetoric they use is, I'm trapped. I don't want to do this. I know this is causing a lot of damage, but I just can't stop. And so the suffering that emerges from this issue, I think is pretty profound. There's still a lot of taboo around it, so it remains beneath the surface, but it's out there, and it's just it's wrecking a lot of lives. So the chance to actually leverage technology to serve us for what we want to do, to be a pro-family tech company, I thought was an opportunity both for my own family, but for others that I couldn't.
And so it brings us to Canopy, the company. How does Canopy work? What does it do?
Yeah, so first, Canopy is software. So you would put this on a smartphone, tablet, or computer. And we're basically leveraging next generation technology to try and deliver you a porn-free internet experience. The two big breakthroughs, and this tech was all developed in Israel, but the two big breakthroughs they put together was, number one, an algorithm was trained to identify nudity and pornography with over 99.7% accuracy. And this is for text, images, and videos. The second thing is they figured out how to do this incredibly quickly in milliseconds. So effectively in real time, as you browse, if you've got Canopy on your smartphone and you're in Safari or Chrome and you're typing in a site, in 20 to 30 milliseconds, our software can scan every word, image, and video on that site. If it's a pornographic site, we'll just block it. If there's only a couple problematic images or videos, we'll just pull those out and still serve up everything else. So we think we have a tool that is as dynamic as the internet itself, where it doesn't matter where the content's coming from on the internet. It doesn't matter if it's a brand new site, never been scanned or categorized before. It doesn't matter if it's a site that has good mixed with bad, like Twitter or Reddit. We can make sure that your internet experience does not feature pornography.
So this is some sort of machine learning algorithm or something like that?
Yeah.
And so it basically just real time looks at whatever's coming in. Can it look inside of apps? So like I have, I was looking at this. I know it was targeting, your app is really designed, I think, for parents to monitor their kids. But as I was looking through it, I'm kind of like, I wouldn't mind having this on my phone, because porn is everywhere. I mean, if you don't have to look for porn, porn will find you. I was just the other day on Twitter, and this is why I bring in the app. So I have a Twitter app on my phone. And I was looking for this account that used to exist. Like, whatever happened to that little account? So I just do a Twitter search, and like half the tweets that come up are pornographic. And it would be nice if all those pornographic tweets were just filtered out. Does your software work on things that are like inside of apps?
It does in different ways. So on iOS, we filter within the vast majority of apps. We currently don't filter within apps that use peer-to-peer encryption. So regrettably, Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram all use peer-to-peer encryption. So what our families will do in that case is they'll block the app and they'll direct their kids to the website itself. Look, and I'll acknowledge there's some big advantages for the apps. So using the Twitter app is a better user experience than Twitter on a website or in a browser. That said, if for most parents, they think the trade-off is worthwhile. On
Twitter
Android,
is a toxic waste dump to which I'm addicted. Unfortunately, that's what I'm addicted to is Twitter.
Yeah, it's compelling. We do filter within TikTok as an example of like a fast-growing app that we can within the TikTok app identify and filter out nudity and pornography. On Android and computer, I mean, there's not really that many apps on computers, but on Android, we've got a really exciting new capability coming out very soon. I'll have more to share, but we'll be able to filter within apps as well.
And does this look at like text messaging or things like that?
So presently, we prevent outbound sexting. We're not scanning text messages that are just words coming in or inbound images that are sent via that. We have plans to do that soon, but we try to prevent outbound sexting through the following means. This is an opt-in feature. If you turn on our anti-sexting capability, the second that you take a photo on your device and it hits the memory of your device, our software will scan it. It's all artificial intelligent. No human looks at it. And if it contains nudity or pornography, we'll pop up a message and say, hey, are you sure you meant to take that? At which point the user can either delete it or send it to their parent for approval, which we hope they don't do if it actually is a sext. But sexting, I mean, just to go back to the prevalence of the extent to which the digital life has become sexualized, 1 out of 4 American teens has received one. 1 out of 7 has sent one. 2/3 of American high school girls have been asked to send a nude photo. So this is a new phenomenon that's kind of taking the porn trend to a whole different level. We wanted to make sure we had a tool to try and block that to the greatest extent, just because digital's forever. And the stories I hear from parents who's, one dad told me about his 16-year-old girl took a photo, shared it with her then boyfriend. They break up. He sends it out to a larger group of guys at the school, and it just crushed his daughter. She's been in counseling for 2 years and transferred to a different school, but wasn't quite the same. And I think that's regrettably more common than I'd like to admit. And we've got to create some way to kind of arrest that trend as well.
Yeah, I got some questions from users. I normally on the show I don't like to try to arbitrate commercial disputes over who's got the best software, but like an obvious question people ask is like, how does this compare to other things that are established, like the software Covenant Eyes, which I know has been very popular in kind of Christian church circles. They were at least about a decade ago. People were touting it. I don't know if they still are. What's different about your software versus some of these other packages?
Yeah, I think there's 2 dimensions in which we differentiate ourselves. So Covenant Eyes is still out there, still very popular, still a great resource for a lot of people. They are focused on accountability. So Covenant Eyes, when you sign up, you will have accountability buddy who will then receive alerts if you visit inappropriate or exposed to inappropriate content, and they then can intervene. And I still think that serves a very important role, and Covenant Eyes provides a great tool for that. So the one dimension.
I did think that was. It's interesting you mentioned that because I seem to recall it was sort of like a lot of it was for adults, was sort of peer-to-peer accountability. And now that you mentioned that, there was some of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And Canopy, on the other hand, is focused on prevention. We want to block and prevent that exposure from happening in the first place. So that's kind of the first dimension. Are you focused on accountability or prevention? Both are really important and will help determine which is the right fit for you. The second is how traditional filters work is they're domain based. They have a catalog of inappropriate websites, and their filter is as good as that list is up to date. And I think that was a functional approach in the early days of the internet, but just does not provide you the coverage that you need today for a few reasons. One, dozens of new porn sites are popping up every day. Most of them are just clones of existing ones to skirt this filter issue. And number two, a lot of pornography appears on some of the most popular platforms and websites that also have good content. So like Twitter and Reddit. And so we're the only tool out there that is looking at the domain, but then also at the content within, where we're not reliant on the domain. Since we scan everything in real time, we can make sure if it's a brand new website, we'll still catch it. If it's a benign website like Twitter, we don't force you to do all or nothing. We can let you go in twitter.com and just pull out the pornographic stuff, but still serve up everything else.
Right. And had another question from a viewer named Jonathan. Is it really easy to subvert like other softwares or internet filters?
Gosh, it's such a good question. So we've invested a ton of energy and effort into what we call to locking the back doors. So a filter is only as good as it is rigorous. And one of the ways we've done this, we've actually got a couple of groups of college guys who will try and hack our software on a periodic basis. And to date, they've not been able to do it, which doesn't mean that we don't still have work to do and try and lock it down. But we've invested significant energy. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I always want to be careful. We don't want to shed light on how you can get around other filters. But one of the common ways to circumvent a filter is to go to an in-app browser. So for instance, if you go to Google Maps and you type in an adult website, the address will sometimes pop up. And then you can click the website within Google Maps. And it'll open a browser within Google Maps. Mm-hmm. So from the device's perspective, you're just into cartography and like off looking at maps all day, when really you're browsing certain things. So that most apps now have in-app browsers. That was a common way to circumvent it. We filter within in-app browsers. So that's one way. Second is, can't you just delete the app? So we've got patents for preventing kids from just deleting it outright to make sure that once this thing is on there, it stays on there. But look, it's a constant game of catch up. I'm sure some enterprising little Steve Wozniak will find some way, and we'll find out and we'll block it. But we've really tried to make this as robust as possible.
You know, even if I'm using like Tor or VPNs or all that good
stuff.
So
it's the great question. So we block Tor browsers. We also prevent the utilization of other VPNs because Canopy utilizes a VPN. So we block that from happening, which results in some trade-offs. Like you can't use DuckDuckGo with Canopy, in part because DuckDuckGo has a encryption protocol that could be used to bypass our filter. So we just block DuckDuckGo. Mm-hmm. So there are some trade-offs to this, but to ensure that Canopy users can't get around it, we really try to batten down the hatches and keep it as secure as possible.
It's not much of a trade-off because DuckDuckGo is not a very good search engine. I hate to say it. I would like for them to be, but they're not. You know what you're describing with this is very much like, maybe it was a year or two ago, I'm like, why don't Apple and Google just do exactly what Canopy does at the OS level on their devices? Allow parents to put on a setting, blocks all the stuff, and then we wouldn't have this stuff. Because in a sense, I think they are enabling this porn because they clearly have the technical chops to be able to do what you're doing. The Israeli tech is extremely good. Okay, Israel's got one of the most sophisticated technology businesses in the world. But Silicon Valley, they're over there. They're everywhere. These are the most sophisticated companies in the world, and yet they won't do it. Now that would be, maybe good or not good for your business. But I did think it was interesting not that long ago that Apple did say they were going to do something like this, and they got huge pushback. Because it was claimed that that they were going to essentially be snooping on all your data. So I'm curious what you think of that, if you've ever gotten complaints about things like that.
Look, there's a couple issues to unpack in there. The first is, why has big tech not jumped in? I'll put a pin in that. Would love to get your thoughts. Yeah. But regarding the Apple thing, they developed the capability to identify pornography is sent through iMessage. And they announced the rollout, and they got a lot of blowback, and so they pulled back, and now they're coming out with a slightly more modest version of that feature. We get a lot of that pushback too, but to be honest with you, the vast majority of parents don't care. It's like I get accused of censoring. It's like I'm censoring an 8-year-old from seeing like horrifically violent porn. Like I'm guilty. Fine.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening. And I mean, I don't do this in polite company, but if you actually are aware of what's going on Pornhub and you're comfortable with just having an 8-year-old have unfettered access to that, like something's wrong with you. Mm-hmm. Like that's just not a defensible, reasonable position. And the status quo effectively is that. And so I don't think it's tenable. The vast majority of parents want to prevent their kids. It's illegal to display this kind of content to kids that are underage. So I think the blowback around Apple was more about Apple really built their brand around privacy and being a great guardian of the user privacy. And this seemed to be a step away from, they might open it up a little bit, and where else would this lead? So I think a lot of it was that. Although I will note, Steve Jobs was famous. He got into a little back and forth with a reporter, and he said, and I quote, I can't remember who phrased it like this: the four most heretical words in America. It's not about freedom. Mm-hmm. And he said that he was blocking porn from the App Store because if you had children, it's about what's doing right for the Apple users. And so from the very outset, Apple has actually kind of taken a stand that some content is not for kids and it's not appropriate, where some of the other tech companies don't have that kind of built into their DNA. But to your point, they've got the technological chops. They have more money and power to make, enough to make Napoleon blush. And they've not moved on this. And I think the big question is why. And do you have any theories?
No, I don't. My understanding is there is some sort of filtering option on the software. Utah, maybe some states have regulated a little bit, but apparently it's not very good because nobody seems to believe this has solved the problem. It would just, I would just like to think that, they could, maybe that's your exit strategy is to sell to Apple eventually or something like that. I don't know, but they could just take this technology. And I think it should sort of be built into the device layer. It's exactly the kind of technology that you would want where you're sort of real time, filtering some of those images. I would certainly think that if it's an adult and it does require sort of ability to access unencrypted content by the network provider or the device provider, and I realize we're getting down to the weeds here, that definitely there is, maybe there is some privacy concerns there. But the reality is, like, if anybody wants your data on your phone bad enough, they're going to get it, right? You're never going to be, you're never going to be defended against that. But certainly for kids, as you say, parents would be happily authorized for their kids' devices. Yes, please monitor all the data on this device and let me see what's on it, as long as you give me access to it. But I do think it's interesting that the phone OS devices have not really stepped up on this at all. They seem very indifferent to it.
I think it's personally, I'm venturing into speculation. I don't have any insider information, but I think it's a few things. And you're seeing at social media, there are powerful incentives that, whether explicit or not, have driven companies to adopt practices that keep you hooked. And pornography is a great attraction that can keep you spending a lot of time online. And so I think there's an element where they recognize that. I think secondly, the broader cultural ethos is they believe in the free flow of information and that there should be as little barriers of that information as possible. Now, you're starting to see a couple of refinements to that. In the last 4 years, Silicon Valley in particular started to step up what kind of content they find acceptable. But broadly speaking, the ethos still is, who are we to cast judgment on certain things, especially in the realm of sexuality? And for a company to adopt a firm stance on what kind of sexual content is appropriate for certain people, I think is very countercultural out in Silicon Valley. And so I think it's going to be hard for them, just from a company culture perspective, to do that. That said, I think that the world is shifting. I mean, you're seeing this with how the techlash from parents and legislators that are putting more pressure. The more we know about how this is impacting the rising generation, in particular, I think the more pressure you'll see for them to do something, to take action. And I think there will be some first mover advantage for the company that takes it seriously and sets themselves up as a trusted guardian of your child's life in the digital space.
All right, I want to remind people we're talking to Sean Clifford. He's the CEO of Canopy, a maker of anti-pornography software to help parents protect their children on smartphones and other devices. Go to canopy.us and check it out. And that's a good point, I think, for us to transition to kind of the last few things I want to talk about is what I call the broader pushback against porn. Because it's one thing to say, okay, how do I protect protect ourselves from the onslaught? How do I protect my kids from this stuff? But it does seem that at sort of the societal level, almost all of the discussion on porn, I mean, it's just evaporated. A couple years ago, Politico did a big article, How the GOP Gave Up on Porn. They're basically all these old, and don't forget, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the Democrats were like pushing back against explicit song lyrics. Remember that with Tipper Gore? And I mean, it was kind of like, now it's like totally gone and nobody at all interested in it. I do find it interesting that the one time recently that Pornhub and them got in trouble really had nothing to do with porn or kids watching your porn, but it was sort of about sex trafficking videos and minor videos, and it was essentially a child exploitation, sexual exploitation angle. The New York Times reported it, and then their credit card processors threatened to cut them off if they didn't do something about it. But you almost, and it's interesting, a lot of the some of these anti-porn, I met a guy a few years ago, and I'd never really thought of it this way. So I run this organization, and he made this point almost in passing. We used to be an anti-porn organization, but nobody cares about that anymore. So we're now all focused on sex trafficking. And you see, everybody talks about sex trafficking, but nobody talks about pornography, which I think it's people seem to have given up. Is there any hope for pushing back at the cultural and legal and societal levels against pornography, or is it something that's going to have to remain as sort of an individual thing to, protect yourself against as best possible?
I actually think there's great hope. And I think the tide is starting to turn. And a lot of that is actually driven by it's going to be ground up just by the sheer number of people that have been impacted by this in a very painful, personal way. So I think messages that point out the prevalence and problems of pornography are just going to resonate at a deeper level because of the groundswell of people that have encountered this in a problematic way. So I think that's the first. I think the second is the science has come a long, long way. And we now understand, both at a very narrow, like neuroscience level, but then also zooming back out to the broader physiology, that porn is bad for public health. And in the same way that you've seen the broader public health movement emerge and focus its sights on an issue and then just steamroll until they prevail on things, whether it's trans fats or the size of a soda you can drink, or most recently vaping, right? When they get going, they get going. And I really think you're going to see the emergence of this, because when you look at the addictiveness of nicotine as compared to pornography, when you look at the prevalence of people vaping as compared to those consuming pornography, and when you look at the physiological impact and harm of vaping versus pornography, honestly, it's not even close. And so there are taboos. There are deep-seated reasons where people will say you're just a prude or a prurient, or that's just an issue for the religious right, or things like that. But I do think you're starting to see the emergence of this new coalition of the public health officials, the pediatricians that are dealing with this, some post-Me Too feminists that are starting to rethink the extent to which their embrace of porn as being sex positive was actually problematic and resulted in some pretty bad outcomes. So I think that more people are talking about this, and just like, again, don't take my word for it. When you just look at a couple of signposts. So Kanye West came out and talked about how painful pornography was for him growing up because his dad left a couple of Playboys out there and he was addicted. John Mayer has talked about this. Terry Crews has talked about this. J.K. Rowling has talked about the challenge of raising girls in this hypersexualized era that effectively tells them that pornography is a viable expression of what they should be and that that's how they will be treated. It's like there's a lot more people that are starting to say, hold on, we've gone too far. So yeah, it's still hard. I still get accused of being just a prude all day, but more and more people, first privately, then some publicly, are coming forward saying status quo is just not sustainable.
Yeah, I'm not as sold on the public health side of it. I was on the American Public Health Association mailing list for way too long, and I think what they kind of choose is very political. Unless there was it kind of became a political consensus. I think you're right. If it became the political consensus that this stuff's got to go, they would mobilize as sort of the enforcers to go out and grind it up. But they're going to have to be triggered on that. The other thing you said that reminded me is like it's like taking me back. It's like in the 90s there were all these alliances between the Republicans and these feminists like Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin. Again, most people probably don't remember that stuff, and now I guess it sounds like we're putting the band back together again or something. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's going to take a different shape than it did previously, and I think I really think that the breakthrough on the data and science is going to be an element that kind of transformed how people talk about this and conceive of it going forward. Because if the traditional framing is a moral one, both sides have heard all the arguments. They kind of put their fingers in the air. They go to their respective corners and like no one budges on the issue. But I think there's going to be a novel framing, in part by the science, in part by just the prevalence of people that have been impacted by it, that does shift how this topic is discussed and unfolds. And I don't know, I think the thing I look at is just, even in the last year, the way in which people are talking about big tech and how much the perspective has shifted. I mean, Jonathan Haidt had this article that described Facebook and Instagram as Instagram was described as Facebook's dangerous experiment on teenage girls. And just really walked through the depression has doubled among teenage girls, and the anxiety and the body, like just all the metrics. And they're really taking Facebook to town right now. And I think you're going to see more and more studies like that come out. Initially focused on tech is a little bit easier of a topic, but the more you dig, like porn's it's the grill in the room. So, yeah,
you were on a panel at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, I believe, focusing on the ills of the social media age, of which porn is merely one. And the whole Instagram thing got me thinking is that it might be difficult to single out the pornography and say we're going to shut down pornography. But if pornography were somehow linked to this greater complex of social media issues and digital tech, maybe they could kind of be regulated along with all the other companies, and especially the many of the techniques that they use, limitations on how it can be done with kids, all that sort of stuff. I mean, do you think that that sort of broader versus narrower is more likely to succeed or not? Or
look, I think when you really jump into the data, you'll see that social media is different from pornography, in part because it's more socially acceptable. It hits a larger number of people purportedly who spend more time on it. And it's public in a way that pornography is not. And so the impact is a little bit different. But when you go to the individual neuroscience studies of what this is doing to the brain, pornography is a more potent version of Instagram in many respects. Maybe you lose the social dimension, but you still get a lot of norm setting and expectation setting that results from it. Look, in the next few years, you're probably going to see some action at the federal level on Section 230 and what responsibility these platforms have for the content that's appearing on there. You alluded to this New York Times piece that forced Pornhub to take down millions and millions of videos. I think that will continue to put pressure on porn companies and what they have available. I also think you're going to see some updates to legislation that regulates what companies can do with kids online. So right now you become an adult from a tech company's perspective at age 13. I think you'll probably see some changes there. There's a lot of talk of putting age verification for certain type of content out there, especially for porn companies. Completely support that idea. In terms of efficacy, I'm not sure how you can make that robust. If it's just a little pop-up box and you say I'm 18, I don't know that it will be an effective hurdle, but you're starting to see a lot more action that's putting pressure on these companies. As that happens, as these companies, so Instagram, for example, now is going to give, not yet, but sometime in Q1, parents the capability to limit some of the more extreme forms of content on their platform. The jump from that to then blocking pornography elsewhere may not be that huge of a one. So as they get more of the tech capability kind of built out internally, and the pressure continues to mount, I think it's some steps that they could take themselves. But this all depends on the pressure continuing to mount, which I think it will.
Yeah, I do think with digital media, there will be a little bit of a pendulum shift. The analogy I like to use is to no-fault divorce. We had this no-fault divorce revolution in the early 70s, and that was the era of the latchkey kids, and we just kind of abandoned all these kids. And then like a decade later in the 1980s, we wake up and went, wait a minute, that was probably a mistake. And then you started having much more. That's when the helicopter parenting came in and the baby on board, and people started paying attention to kids again. And I think it's going to be similar. We had, we went like 10 years of this digital only world, that this iGen or whatever you called them. And now we're looking at that and say, wow, that did not produce good results. We better make some adjustments. And it probably doesn't mean going back to the way it was, but it probably does mean that people are going to find a way to let's get a handle on this technology in some way and tame it a little bit, lest it, overwhelm our society.
Yeah, I think most American families on a somewhat regular monthly, weekly basis are asking how technology is shaping their lives and if it's doing so in a way consistent with what they want for their lives. We get questions on this all the time. Even when I'm outside, I'm not wearing my Canopy hat, I'm at a cocktail party. This is like an evergreen topic, how technology is shaping us, whether it's looking at big tech, whether it's looking at the health and well-being of kids, whether it's our own habits, which there was an interesting poll that tracked the percentage of people who would prefer to go a full day without food than a full day without their smartphone. And more people would prefer to fast from food for a day than fast from their tech. And so, look, we're all wrestling with this. We're still in the early innings. We're still figuring it out. And I don't think the status quo will persist, in part because people recognize that it's not giving us what we want. So things will move. I think a lot of it there will be cultural antibodies, to kind of go with your analogy, that do emerge. Sometimes through individual habits, but sometimes through pressure as applied through the media or regulation.
Well, I certainly hope some of these, broader changes, legal changes, cultural changes do happen. But in the meantime, you can take action to protect your own kids. And so I'd encourage people to check out Canopy, see if it's a good fit for you. It looks very interesting. I like the idea of the kind of technology. Again, I think they should build it into the operating system level, and maybe they can buy the company, and then they won't have to actually develop the software. And
I'll pass that along.
So it's canopy.us. So Sean, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for the conversation, Aaron.